Okay. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. My name is Amani Sharafuddin, and I am the program coordinator here at Nisa Helpline, and I'm also going to be your host for the day. So thank you all for joining our workshop on overcoming imposter syndrome in collaboration with Bell Let's Talk. So through our partnership, we're hosting a series of virtual workshops on her wellness journey. And these workshops are designed to improve Muslim women's access to social support, build self-esteem, and emotional well-being. So before we begin, we do have a few rules we would like for you to consider just to make sure that our workshop runs smoothly, inshallah. So number one, I want to ask that you please make sure that your mics are off just to not accidentally disturb the session. And number two, if you do have any questions during the session, and questions are more than welcome, please, if you're on Zoom, just use the Q&A window to ask your question to the host and panelist, and we'll either reply to you via text in the Q&A window, or we'll answer your question during the live. And then for those of you joining us on Facebook, welcome. First of all, please share your questions in the comment section, and we will also be answering those during the live as well. And then finally, our third rule is to please answer our polling questions, which we will be sharing during the session. And this just allows us to keep you engaged and helps us understand you, your needs, and your preferences for future workshops, inshallah. Okay, now without further ado, this evening we are joined by our honored guest, Dr. Areeba Adnan. So a little bit about Dr. Adnan. She provides assessments and therapy services to individuals with many mental health concerns, including concussions, acquired brain injury, healthy aging and dementia, and psychological health. In the last decade, she has spent her time working in various clinical settings, including hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and inpatient and outpatient settings in multiple provinces, mashallah. Dr. Adnan is also trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, emotional focused therapy, humanistic therapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction. She also provides cognitive training for individuals experiencing issues with their memory, ability to focus, or organizational and planning skills. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Areeba Adnan. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Adnan. How are you doing?
Walaikum salam. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Now, just quickly before we begin, and I know I'm like keeping you paused for a little bit, we just ask that you respond to the first set of survey questions that I mentioned earlier. And if you feel uncomfortable responding, that is also totally okay. You're not obligated to answer, but if you do reply, know that your answers will remain anonymous. So I'll give you guys approximately a minute or two to answer these questions, just because they're fairly easy and shouldn't take that much time. So I'm going to launch those right now. Here you go. Great, I'm seeing some responses. Give you guys another 30 seconds. Oh, I'm sorry about that. We'll definitely include it in the next time. Thank you for catching that. Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to end it now. Great. So thank you guys all for your input. And Dr. Adnan, the stage is all yours now.
Thank you, Mani. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Dr. Areeba Adnan. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist in the province of Ontario. I am also the director of my own practice called Salam Psychology, which has started this year. So if you're looking to find me later on, that's where you can find me at salampsychology.com. And today we'll be spending the next hour talking about how to overcome imposter syndrome. I'm sure you are familiar familiar with this term or have at least heard about it, which is what prompted you to sign up for this seminar and this series. So I hope we can spend the next hour talking about what is imposter syndrome, how to identify it, what are some of the potential causes for it, what it may look like in your daily life or in everyday settings, especially at work or school or family life. I will go into lots of detail about what that cycle can look like. And then we'll talk about how to overcome imposter syndrome in the second half of the talk. I like to lay out a foundation for what actually is imposter syndrome because knowledge is power and we need to understand the issue at hand before we can actually overcome it. And that is if you've been to therapy or if you're interested in going to therapy, that is the approach a lot of clinicians also take. There's a lot of education and I hope to provide you with some of that today. So first off, I have a question for you and it is if this is you. So do you ever struggle at work because you feel like a fraud, or that any day now that your boss and coworkers will figure out that you really don't know what you're talking about? And you'll get a poll question where this is one of those things that you resonate with. I would love to hear because this will help me set the stage for which one kind of fits into what category you're in. So you can just answer yes or no if this is something that you resonate with. It could be both, but I just love to hear if imposter syndrome or any feelings like this are things that you struggle with.
Okay, I'll just give another 2 seconds or 20.
Yeah, so it may be related to school, it may be related to work. It can be any of the different scenarios or situations that you're in your daily life. Okay, so I see some yeses and some nos, and the yeses are here, and there are some no's. And so I wonder, I'm going to come back, maybe some of the people who said no will have questions for me later on. So I'm curious to hear about the no and if you're feeling something different. Close this. Thank you for answering. So let's dive into the meat of the topic. Why is my screen not working? Oh, here. So first of all, what is imposter syndrome? This term relates to feeling like an imposter, as you may have guessed. And it describes the feeling that someone struggles with when they're having a hard time recognizing their own accomplishments. And so they can feel like any moment the people around them will figure out that they're a fraud and they don't really know the things they act like they do. So if you were to think of whether you're an accountant or a psychologist or anybody else, you feel like you're going to be found out that you don't really know what you're doing. And people experiencing imposter syndrome may feel like they have deceived those around them and they need to continue to kind of put on this act or put on this front. And they may feel like they're not performing at the same level as those they're working with. So this is pretty common in a school setting or a colleague setting where you don't feel like you're good enough or your accomplishments are not good enough. Some common signs of imposter syndrome, as you can put together, are that you think your accomplishments are only the result of luck or external sources and not from your own hard work or your strengths. You also believe that anybody could do what you do, so you're not special or talented in any specific way. You think you've succeeded because you had help and not because you contributed to it yourself as well. You discredit your achievements, so it's hard for you to say, oh, I did a great job, or hard for you to accept where you succeeded. You believe your connections and network are why you've been successful. You think people are just being nice when complimenting you and they don't really mean it. So this can look like, having a hard time saying thank you to others when they say, oh, you did a great job. We say, oh, that was nothing. We kind of dismiss it in that sense. And you struggle with being a perfectionist. So it's really difficult to accept work that is not perfect because then it's going to amplify that belief that you're not good enough compared to others. And failure is absolutely not an option when you're struggling with imposter syndrome, because if you fail, that means you're going to get found out, and of course you're not talented. So if you get found out, then that's not okay. And you use minimizing language like just, kind of, pretty sure, so you don't have to commit to statements or risk being incorrect. And I want to highlight that a lot of times we see this as okay because we see this as being humble or humility, but there's a fine line being humble and accepting compliments with grace, but also discrediting yourself or putting yourself down. When we have imposter syndrome, it's not really humility, it's actually the thoughts are very negative and critical, and your own internal dialogue is that, you're a failure, like you're not good enough, anybody can do what you can do, while being humble is kind of like a more moderate approach. And then on the extreme end, we have arrogance as well. So I'm not saying that you have to be completely arrogant to not have imposter syndrome. It's finding this balance between your thoughts and acknowledging your accomplishments and taking ownership of that. So you may be wondering, and of course, if you have any questions, as Amani mentioned earlier, you can write them in the Q&A or the chat box and we will answer them. There's a dedicated Q&A time at the end. And I will definitely get to all of those. So who experiences imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome can affect anyone regardless of their job or social status or religious beliefs. But here is who it impacts more. So it impacts people who are high achieving. So if you are someone who strives for perfectionism, or you have high standards for yourself, you are more likely to struggle with these internal negative thoughts related to feeling like an imposter. Women tend to struggle a lot with it, although there is recent research that suggests that both genders suffer from it equally. The early research suggests women, and I assume I'm talking to a lot of women today. So that's why I highlighted this point, that we are more likely to experience this. And also racial minorities. So this is really, really critical, especially when our experiences, our education, coming from immigrating, migrating from different areas of the world, we can sometimes feel like we're underqualified, we don't have enough experience. And while that may be so on paper, we often put down ourselves even after we've gotten enough experience. So this is something that really significantly impacts racial minorities, and something I see with my clients all the time. And so it may be, it brings the question, like, why is it important to fight imposter syndrome? We have these thoughts, why should we be caring so much about them? People are living their lives, they're going forward, why does it matter? And imposter syndrome, it's really this internal dialogue that happens in our minds, and it can stifle your potential for growth. It can reduce your self-esteem. It can prevent people from pursuing new opportunities for work, for growth at work, in relationships, in their hobbies. It can really have an impact on all of these different aspects of your life. And when your growth, your self-esteem, your purpose is impacted, that can have a negative impact on your overall mood, your anxiety levels, how you approach relationships, interpersonal problems. So what can start off as an internal dialogue can, for a lot of people, snowball into depression or anxiety. So often we see imposter syndrome as presenting clinically with clinical anxiety or depression, not to say that they are always occurring together, but it just highlights the importance of understanding this phenomenon of cognitions that we have, of thoughts that we have, and really understanding how to overcome it. And confronting imposter syndrome can help you continue to grow and thrive, which can be really important in mental health. Now, there are some really interesting types of imposter syndrome. Some of them overlap, but this is really interesting research I thought we could talk about. And maybe I'm going to ask you if you do relate to any of these. You may not, and that's totally fine, but there are some that you may relate to. So the first one that we often hear about is, this is a very common one. It's called the perfectionist. This type of imposter syndrome believes that unless you're absolutely perfect, you could have done better. There's always room to do better. And your perfectionistic traits can make you believe that you're not as good as others might think you are. So this is where perfectionism really ties in. The next kind is the expert. So the expert feels like an imposter because they don't know everything. And even though they're the expert, they haven't learned enough. So there's always room to learn more, and they don't feel as if they've reached the rank of the expert. So a good example is someone who has a PhD in a very specific topic. And even after they've been awarded the degree, they don't feel like they're the expert, even though having a PhD really in the court of law and everything means you're the expert. This kind of imposter thoughts can be really detrimental to self-esteem in that sense. Another kind of imposter syndrome is a natural genius. So here people may feel like they're a fraud simply because they don't think they're smart enough. They don't think they're intelligent or competent. And if they take long to master a skill, they're not smart enough, so why even bother? And that can impact behavior, that can lead people to, kind of withdraw. These kinds of thoughts, as you can imagine, really impact people's self-esteem, as I've mentioned before. Excuse me. Another kind of imposter is the soloist. So this is someone who has a really hard time asking for help, because if you ask for help, that means that you don't know enough. And if you don't know enough, you're going to get caught out, you're going to get called out, and that will make you question your own competence or abilities. Another type is a super person. So this person believes that you have to work the hardest, you have to work the longest hours, the hardest on a presentation, on a project, on a report, whatever it is you're working on, and you must get like an A++ possible. And if you don't, you're not good enough. So the super person and the perfectionist are similar, but they're also different because there's perfectionism tied to that one, the first one. So now I'm curious if you could take a minute, and if you resonate with any of these, and let me know in the poll if you think you're a perfectionist, an expert, natural genius, soloist, super person. So you don't have to answer if you don't resonate, but I'm curious if any of these struck a chord for you.
I'll just give another 10 seconds.
Is the poll closed now? Oh, here, okay. Okay, so we have a pretty good split. I suspected the perfectionist would be the most common because that is really, really widely seen. The expert and the soloist, okay, and then we have some super persons and some natural geniuses. Great to know. I think this is really valuable information, and I'm happy to see that you guys are engaging, and some of these resonate with you, and I wonder if this felt like, oh, that's me, and that's probably why you clicked. So if we are to so imposter syndrome may present as these different five, but oftentimes in your behaviors, in what happens for most people, there are two patterns of behaviors. So when we have thoughts around not being good enough, not being a perfect, like not being an expert, not having talent, difficulty asking for help, not being absolutely 100% always on point, it can lead us to do certain things differently. So sometimes people can fall into one of two camps, and these are the ones that we most commonly see. So I'm going to talk about these two cycles of behavior that happen in imposter syndrome. So now that we've talked about what kind of imposter syndrome, what it looks like, why is it important, we're going to dive into what behaviors can happen for people, for individuals that you may be experiencing in your everyday life. So one camp is the over preparer and the other camp is the procrastinator. So these are the two kinds of behaviors that occur as a consequence of these thoughts that you have when you're faced with imposter syndrome. So the first cycle that we're going to talk about is the cycle of the over preparer. And this is someone who over prepares, as the title suggests. And so I'll walk you through this example. So say, for example, you have an upcoming presentation or project. So if I was to apply this to myself in this talk, I've been working on this presentation. I have had this coming up for a few months. I've known about it. Worked diligently for weeks and months on preparing the perfect presentation. So if this was me, it would have looked like I've been working on this talk since September. I spent 2 hours a day on it. There can be no mistakes. It has to be perfect. The presentation happens and I do well on it. Oh, what happened here? Sorry, it disappeared. I do well on it. And what that looks like is, I get praise for it. You can get good feedback, people ask questions and you are able to answer them. But then I have a difficult time accepting the praise and I discount that positive feedback. What that means is that when somebody says, great job, I say, oh, that was nothing. It's really easy. I didn't really work super hard on it. Or I discount it by internally thinking they didn't really mean that. I could have answered that better. I could have said this differently. I talked too fast. I didn't have enough slides, etc., etc. And ignoring this positive feedback that you receive leads to increased self-doubt about your skills and abilities. So now it perpetuates its cycle of where you're doubting your skills and where you're doubting your abilities. And this amplifies imposter syndrome. So now that you feel like you really didn't really do a good job, now when you have a presentation again the next time, you're going to work on it for even longer. And you'll do it. And then again, it will be hard to accept praise. And the cycle perpetuates these negative thoughts about your own skills and ability that you have. So this is what it looks like for the over preparer. On the flip side, we have the procrastinator. So this is someone who can procrastinate, so putting off things till the last minute. So they have an upcoming presentation or project, they procrastinate, they do the presentation and they do well on it. So the night before they're working on it, the morning of the presentation, etc. And they do fine on it. Now they get feedback and they're like, no, I didn't do well because I know I spent only 2 hours making this. So they ignore the positive feedback. And this amplifies their imposter syndrome again. So now they start to doubt their actual skills. And now because they think they're not good enough, next time around, they're anxious. They feel worried, like, oh, I didn't really do a good job last time. I put it off till the last minute. And you would think that those thoughts would actually make you do it earlier. But for a lot of people, that those thoughts really significantly get in the way. So they procrastinate even further. So they may completely leave it off till the last minute because it's too anxiety provoking to work on that project or presentation. Excuse me. Okay. Now, these are the two most common kinds, and there are many different causes of imposter syndrome. So, these are just some causes that research has found are linked to imposter syndrome. I'm not saying that one is more significant than the other, but these are related. So first we have parenting styles. So parenting styles are different. There's lots of research in discussing how parents interact or raise their children, which can lead to early signs of children developing these imposter syndrome thoughts. So for example, if your parents, somebody's parents are controlling or overprotective, that can contribute to developing imposter syndrome. If someone's parents go back and forth between offering praise and being critical, so there's inconsistent patterns of interaction with children, that can lead to confusion in children's minds, and they start to think that they're not good enough, that their parents are not giving them consistent praise. Or sometimes there are family structures where there's a lot of conflict, and there's not a lot of support, emotional support for children who are seeing this conflict kind of play out, whether it's passive aggressive arguments or direct arguments or abuse or whatever it may be. It can, when there's low support, children are more likely to develop these feelings that they're not a good enough X, Y, and Z, whatever that career or pattern may look like. And a lot of the parenting styles and family upbringing, they tie into self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is this belief in your ability to that you can succeed in any given situation. So no matter what hardship you're faced with, you can overcome it. That's someone who believes that has high self-efficacy. But when there's an environment where there's difficult relationships at home, there's conflict, there may be trauma, there may be a controlling or authoritarian parenting style, or conflict between the parents, that can lead to low self-efficacy and low self-esteem. And it can also lead to traits of perfectionism. So if the parent, say, is inconsistent in providing support, children learn to do things just right. They have to achieve a certain standard to get that approval from parents, and that can breed perfectionism. That can breed people-pleasing behaviors. There's also other personality traits that could come up where, there's different personality traits if you're familiar with those, and it can influence style of personality and behaviors, and even anxiety, so social anxiety. So social anxiety is a unique diagnosis. It's not the same as imposter syndrome. Psychologically, there's no actual diagnosis for imposter syndrome. It's often considered as under the umbrella of anxiety, but social anxiety is different, but they can often co-occur. So someone who is very anxious to be in a social situation can also feel like an imposter, but their primary concern would be, I struggle with just being around people, they're judging me, and they may also have imposter syndrome. So these are different reasons for why we can experience these, and it really highlights the importance of a stable home, secure attachment styles, and supportive upbringing. Now, if we talk about how to overcome imposter syndrome, you're like, okay, now I have all this knowledge, Dr. Adnan, like, what do I do about it? How can I overcome it? So to overcome imposter syndrome, we've already done the first step. We have some knowledge of it. You engage with the questions that I've been asking. You understand the different kinds of imposter syndrome. You understand why it happens. Maybe you're able to take some of that information and say, oh, okay, that was kind of my life and my experience. Those are my experiences. That explains why. Another really helpful tool is to understand this cycle that I have put up on the screen here, where we understand the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And this is a recurring cycle, and these arrows actually go back and forth. They're double-sided. So thoughts can influence emotions, and emotions can influence thoughts, emotions influence behaviors, etc. So they all interact. And this pattern is specifically activated in certain situations. So for example, the situation is that, let's use the example of this presentation that I'm giving. I'll use myself as an example. So I'm giving this talk and I have an I feel like I'm not a good enough psychologist. Let's say those are my thoughts. In this situation, I'm a new psychologist. I don't know what I'm doing. My colleagues know better. Those are my thoughts that come up. So I'm giving this presentation, and if I get praise, my thoughts will be, oh, like I don't really know anything. I'm not really an expert. I don't actually know anything. It was all just by luck. It's no big deal. This can lead to emotions. It can lead me to feel like I'm not a good enough psychologist. I don't really know what I'm doing. Leads to self-doubt, leads me to worry about, what's going to happen if somebody actually approaches me for help after. Will I really be able to help them? I start to doubt my own self. And then continuing in the same line, the behaviors that I may engage in are that I may downplay my success. I have difficulty accepting compliments. I procrastinate or over prepare next time. And then the cycle can repeat itself. Now, if we want to overcome imposter syndrome, it's really critical to be mindful of those thoughts. This is the first step in overcoming imposter syndrome. Really understanding what your thoughts are, having a detailed log can be helpful. So, if you acknowledge that I have these thoughts sometimes, and a specific situation comes up where you've had a hard time accepting praise or engaging with these thoughts, you can actually write them down. And a great way to look at the thoughts is by writing the problematic thought down and putting it on trial. So you're taking the thought, making the thoughts take the stand, and you're saying, okay, is this really, really true? And it's important to focus on the facts. So say if my thought is that I'm not a good enough psychologist, I'm not qualified enough, I would sit down and list out all of my qualifications. I have an MA, I've done this, I've done that. You would list it all out. And then that's all the factual evidence that doesn't support that thought. Then you would write down all the evidence that you think supports that thought. Like, okay, am I really not an expert? Like, do I not have any experience at all? And in my case, that column would be empty because I do have experience. I do have, credentials and all of that. So that's just an example. So if you were to apply it to any scenario, you would make this challenge. You're challenging your thoughts by focusing on the facts, by focusing on the hard evidence. And the thing that imposter syndrome does is that it makes you believe that what you know is very small and what others know is very big. And what we want to get to by challenging our thoughts is this reality. What I know versus what others know. So as an expert, what I know is up here. It overlaps with what others know a little bit, but it's not completely overlapping, meaning I have unique knowledge, unique talents, unique expertise. But imposter syndrome makes me think, that I don't really know anything. Some helpful questions that you can use to shift your focus from the assumptions to the facts. So really by challenging or putting those thoughts on trial can be like, what would I tell a friend who was in the same situation? So if your friend came to you and said, oh my gosh, I had a presentation, I had a project, a work deadline, and my boss gave me great feedback, but like, I didn't really do a great job. What would you tell them? What would you say to them as a neutral, supportive friend? And that's the same language we want to use for our own thoughts and our own situations. And again, what evidence do you have that these thoughts are true? You want to always challenge those thoughts. And what evidence do I have that does not support these thoughts? What's the likelihood of this actually happening or being true? So how likely is it that someone will come to me and say, oh, you're a fraud? Like that's the worry in imposter syndrome, but like how likely is it that will actually happen or that somebody has actually said this? Am I discounting the positives in the situation? Am I overlooking my own accomplishments? Am I not looking at how much praise I received? That's very common. So shifting your thoughts from the assumptions to the facts, like actually looking at the evidence can be really helpful. And then is this pattern of thinking actually helpful to me? Is this useful? Like, why am I engaging in these thoughts? Because oftentimes this spiral starts and we're not able to pause it. We just kind of get sucked into this vortex and it impacts your mood. It can make you probably more irritable. It can feel like that's it, like I'm not good enough. And it can be really helpful to say, okay, well, the evidence says that I am good. So like, what is the point of me engaging with these thoughts? And that helps you fight back those thoughts. And do I have sufficient knowledge and understanding of my area to work well in my job? So that ties into looking at the evidence as well. So these are some questions that you can use to help you shift your focus from, I don't know anything to, okay, I do know something. It can also be really helpful to share your feelings. So, we often talk about sharing our feelings in therapy, but this is an example where you can reach out to others who are maybe colleagues or coworkers or trusted people that in your circle who are in the same profession or in the same aspect of your, place in their life that you're in, and you can connect with. And sharing your feelings with them, not a therapist, but someone else, can reduce loneliness, but also allow them to say, oh, like what, like that's not true, you're so, like they'll tell you all the things that a friend will tell you, and it can be really helpful to hear that from someone else. Excuse me. It can be really helpful to hear that from someone else. And you can, by venting to a trusted individual outside of your professional circle, for example, if you're worried, what if I can't talk to someone at work? It can help provide a more helpful picture of your own accomplishments and values. And so, having these relationships is really important as well. And it can help to share your feelings with others. And this is really, really key when you are a visible minority. So when you're a visible minority, you already doubt you may already doubt your ability, or if English is not your first language, you may already doubt, is my presentation good enough? Are there going to be mistakes in there? Is my grammar good? So talking to someone else who is also a visible minority can really breed this feeling of a community, knowing that you are not alone in your struggles. And we know that minority individuals are more likely to experience imposter syndrome thoughts. So talking to others is really, really helpful. I want you to think, if you struggle with imposter syndrome, if you can think of someone in your life, at work, in your trusted circle, who you can share your feelings with. Is there someone that you can reach out to and just talk about, oh, this happened at work, I'm feeling this way. I just want to hear if this is something that you think of. Is this the support that's already in your life?
I've shared the question, but I'm not getting much engagement. Just want to make sure everyone else sees it.
I can see it.
Okay. Okay, I'll stop sharing and share it again.
Okay. I don't see anything, Lenny.
Okay. Okay, sorry guys, it's glitching on my end. If we can get everybody to raise their hand if they agree with this question, that would help us answer the question. Yep, I'm seeing a lot of hands raising.
Okay, so if you say yes, put your hand up. That's good. So people are still here, which is good. Okay, yeah. So it's important to have someone that you can think of who can be that person that you rely on. And if you raise your hand, that's really great. I think that I can think of one person right off the bat in my circle who I can share these feelings of imposter syndrome that I also struggle with, and a lot of us struggle with. Another thing that we can do to overcome imposter syndrome is taking note of our accomplishments. So this is particularly challenging because when you struggle with these thoughts, you tend to brush off your successes, which makes the whole imposter syndrome worse. You say, oh, I didn't do good enough. It's fine. So if someone congratulates you, don't move on too fast. Pay attention to how you respond, what your body language is. If someone says that was really great, do you kind of cower down, or do you oh, okay, that was really good? Or do you feel like a knot in your stomach? Do you feel tightness in your shoulders? Pay attention to cues that are coming from you physically, because our body is often in sync with our thoughts. And our thoughts they have a unique impact on our body. So when we put ourselves down, our body language may mimic that. So take the time to pay attention to these small cues. Does getting praise make you nervous? Does your heart rate go up thinking, oh, they're complimenting me, meaning I must, it's not good enough? Are they going to tell me I did something wrong next? It makes you question. So pay attention to your bodily cues. And then once you recognize these, slow yourself down a little bit. So take a few deep breaths when someone is applauding you. Don't say, oh no, it was fine, no big deal, too fast. Learn to say thank you. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. And That can help you when you repeat these statements over and over again in different contexts. It can help you fight those thoughts, because when they come up next, you'll be like, no, I did do a good job. It helps you internalize your success. So you could simply reflect on your efforts. Concrete reminders are also important. So for example, this is something that I did as a graduate student, and I think it's really, really helpful. So as a graduate student or and if you're doing your degree, you send assignments or papers for submission and you get feedback. Anytime I would get positive feedback, I would print it out and I would put it on my desk. And so you can save it in your email, you can print it out, you can put it in a place where you are likely to see it, so that when you're working or when you're doing your job, when those thoughts come, you can be like, nope, let me open up that folder that I have of positive feedback. So I think this really helped me as a graduate student, because when you're trying to publish papers, you get a lot of rejections, you get a lot of criticism. So when you get that acceptance, like it is like blown up and put on my computer because I got that paper accepted, and it's important for me to recognize that. So that can be really helpful. The accomplishments don't have to be really big. They can be small wins. So I think this is really, really key. We often wait for like really, really big wins to happen, and we try to, have that there. But remember, small wins also matter. It's also important to letting go of perfectionism a bit. So lower the bar, but doesn't mean that, you're not going to try to do a good job. It just means that it's okay if things are not, perfect. And when you don't meet your standards, it's okay to see that as a failure. It's okay to see that, it's okay to like resist the urge to see that as a failure, that this means that I'm going to be exposed. That is not true. So fight those thoughts at that point. And it's important to reframe your failures as opportunities to learn and grow. So that means that, if you failed, it's okay. It's just one failure. It doesn't mean that you are a failure. So this can tie into, being cultivating self-compassion. So oftentimes when we struggle with imposter syndrome, we have a hard time taking care of ourselves because it's not something we're used to doing. So eating healthy, going for a massage, taking a walk, self-compassion can be physical, and it can look like comforting your body as well. Something that is really interesting that I ask clients to do sometimes in sessions is to write a letter to themselves. So I ask them to write a letter describing the situation, but don't blame yourself. Don't blame anything. Just put down what your thoughts are. So try to observe the situation without judgment and write that down. And that can help you see the exact scenario, the exact situation without negative thoughts. And this is a really difficult exercise. So if you do this, remember to be compassionate to yourself, that it may not be easy the first time. Give yourself encouragement. So think of what you would say to a good friend, what kind of words you would use, and try to use the same words for yourself. Practicing mindfulness is really, really great. So a quick exercise, maybe for even a few minutes, going for a mindful walk, noticing the sights, the sounds, the smells as you walk, taking in the environment can be really, really helpful for us to, accept where we are in our life. So if I was to ask you, okay, today is Tuesday, what's an act of self-compassion that you can engage in this week? If you were to pick one thing you could commit to doing, it could be being mindful for a minute, 1 minute, 2 minutes, going for a walk alone, or writing in a journal. What can you tell me that you feel confident doing this week for yourself as an act of self-compassion? I don't know if the poll questions are going to work again, but maybe we'll do hand raising again. Amani, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, it's not working on my end. Can you actually get them commented on the side?
Okay. Poll is not working. Going for a walk alone. Mindful minute. Awesome. Journaling. I see your answers coming in. That's wonderful. So a mindful minute. Awesome. Exercise. You use the Headspace app. Yeah, there's some really great apps that you can use as well for the mindful minutes. So if you have like an Apple Watch, it has a mindfulness minute option in here. You can use different apps and so forth. Great. You can keep commenting, and that's really, really helpful. And so if you've commented and written what you're going to do, I will hold you accountable to that. Here are some poll results. Wonderful. So your task, your homework for after this talk is that you're going to do that thing that you said you would do in the poll or in the comments. And if you want, you can send me a note on Instagram or an email after that I did that thing that we talked about in the session. Remember, so seeking help is really important when you're struggling with imposter syndrome. So remembering that a single failure does not make you a fraud or a failure as a whole. And it's okay to ask for help and support if you're struggling with feelings of self-doubt, self-esteem, and feeling like you're not good enough. And surprisingly, a lot of people feel like this. So you are certainly not alone, which is why it can be helpful to talk to someone else and seek help concurrently. And I like to put this up, and I like to tell people this over and over again. A failure does not make you a fraud. A failure doesn't mean that you are a failure. So I'll give you an example, which I often tell others, is that, as a psychologist or any professional, you have to do licensing exams. And one of the first exams that we have to write is a very, very difficult exam. It's, I think, 500 questions, and it's 5 hours long or something like that. I can't remember now. I failed it by 1 point the first time I wrote it. And I remember this exact feeling that I have failed this, so I am never going to be a psychologist. I am not good enough to be here, and all of my colleagues will pass, and I'm just going to be here writing this exam over and over again. And it's really difficult. As someone who has been in that place, if you failed an exam of any kind or a significant, some milestone, you feel like a fraud. And a friend said to me that it's just an exam. It doesn't mean that all of your training doesn't exist. It's just one exam. And then I started talking to people, and I realized that a lot of people fail these exams. It's not very unusual for them to fail this really, really difficult exam that's designed, for people to fail, basically. And I wrote it again, and I passed. And it was like, oh, I do know stuff. It's just that one time I didn't get 2 questions right and I failed. Doesn't mean I don't have the knowledge. So it is really, really helpful to remember that one failure doesn't mean that you are a fraud. It doesn't mean that you are a failure. Because oftentimes our thoughts can be like this bad black and white thinking. It's not supposed to, that's not true. And that's why challenging those thoughts is really, really important. I find this to be really helpful for, I share this a lot with clients as well. These are some great self-help books. If you want to screenshot this, or you'll also have access to the recording after, so you can get the names after as well. But these are some great books to either listen to or read that can help provide, some more context that can make you feel like you're not alone in this journey if you are struggling with these thoughts. And if you're looking for more support, here are some resources. So Nisa Helpline, you can always call them. I put their number here for you. You can reach out to me at my practice. You can go to psychologytoday.com to find a therapist or psychologist close to you. There's also the Canadian Mental Health Association. There's also different anxiety clinics and programs. But these are the 4 main ones that, came to mind for me. So feel free to reach out at any time if you're interested in that. And if you're struggling with imposter syndrome, you're welcome to reach out to me directly if you're interested in getting therapy or anything like that. I'm happy to help. Now, we are going to turn it over to questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll let Amani kind of back me in this part.
Yeah, Mashallah, we got a lot of questions. So I'm going to say from now, we're going to try to answer as much as we can. And also we did get some questions with some detail. And so we tried to edit it as much as possible so that we can maintain, anonymousness to everyone, inshallah. So I'm going to ask you the questions now. Okay.
Sure.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for this amazing presentation. I think every one of us, including myself, have learned a lot and can definitely relate to all of this. Okay, So our first question for you, Dr. Adnan, is regarding the type of imposter syndrome. Can we be more than one kind? Because with the description given, I feel like I resonate with more than just one.
Great question. I think that absolutely every situation that you're in can bring about a different kind of thought process. So you can be the soloist, say as a mother, where you feel like it's really hard to ask for help. And so that prevents you from reaching out for help because then you're not going to be a good enough mom. And then at work, you're a perfectionist. So in different scenarios, you can have different kinds of imposter syndrome and thoughts associated with that play out. Absolutely.
Okay, makes sense. I think I had the same question too. When I heard this, I was like, oh, I can relate to more than one. So it's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. And our next question is it possible for kids to experience imposter syndrome? I see some of this in my child. How can we encourage and instill confidence in our kids while balancing the fine line of arrogance? It's a loaded question.
It's a big question, and I will preface it by saying that I don't work with children, so I don't have experience with working with children. But as a mother, I can comment on this a little bit. So maybe that can be helpful. So I think that kids certainly can experience feelings of not being good enough. They can experience feelings of low self-esteem. And I think the best way that as a parent or from a psychological perspective, we can foster confidence and kind of not go towards arrogance, but maintain humility is like we can teach them to say thank you. We can teach them to say, you did a good job. We can teach them that their self-worth isn't tied to their success. So one of the things that we often do is that we call kids smart. Oh, you're so smart. Oh, you're a genius. So kids start to internalize that language around themselves. We can say, oh, you did a great job. That was a really beautiful painting. That was a really well done test. So that the language distinction separates out their performance from their identity. So if we can watch what we say to our kids in terms of, you're so beautiful, you're so smart, you're this, you are blank, versus you did a really great job there. I saw how hard you worked. Those are two different things. And the latter helps foster self-confidence. While the former, you are this, it can sometimes, I'm not saying always, lead to, oh, I need to always perform at this level to be good enough.
Gotcha. So it's more like reacting to the behavior rather than the person.
Exactly.
Right? Makes sense. Okay. And our next question is, what are the differences between confidence and imposter syndrome?
Confidence and imposter syndrome. So confidence is when you take ownership of your accomplishments and your abilities and your successes. And imposter syndrome is when it's a really difficult time to say, I did a great job. So you have low self-confidence. Am I getting the question right?
That's how I understood it.
Okay.
Great. And if a person has developed the syndrome due to the desire to get attention and love from their parents, and they still struggle with this as an adult, what can they do to overcome this? Also
yeah, it's a big question. I think first of all, having awareness that these are some behaviors that I engage in. Some common behaviors that can happen for people who experience this is they try to keep everybody happy around them. They have a hard time asking for help. They doubt themselves. So just what we talked about, first step is always acknowledging, oh, like this is how it's impacting me. Then as we said, we can talk to others, we can, go to therapy. So oftentimes we, what I see in clients is that we wait for a crisis to go to therapy. We wait for like our world to kind of fall apart before we seek help. And in fact, if you're noticing that these patterns occur for you and they impact your everyday well-being negatively, but you're not in crisis yet, it's still important to talk about them and explore your own behaviors and maybe work on changing your thought patterns. So that's another avenue that you can take.
Okay, makes sense. And another one we have is, what can someone do when there are real life evidences of struggle, such as underemployment, discrimination, or other contexts that reinforce existing imposter syndrome and the tendency to be an overachiever?
So that's a really, really good question. So sometimes in our life, there can be evidence of you feeling like you're not good enough. So somebody actively leaves you out at work, you're being discriminated against. And in those cases, our anxious brain tells us that, hey, look at that, there's evidence that you're not good enough. It makes us doubt our own abilities. And at that point, I think what's really helpful is understanding or recognizing how much of that is actually tied to you and how much of that is actually tied to that person. So oftentimes when somebody does something, we personalize it. It becomes about us. We take it as it's directed at me. And personalization is a form of unhelpful thinking. It's an unhelpful thinking pattern that comes about with anxiety. And when there's discrimination, when there is sometimes evidence of behaviors that others do, it's hard to challenge those thoughts. And that's where, when you work with someone directly, they can help you with it. It can be helpful to identify different cognitive patterns that you may engage in.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And here we have another one. Do you think there's a link between anxiety and imposter syndrome tendencies?
Yeah, absolutely. They always co-occur. So someone who has imposter syndrome is definitely someone who the thoughts are always tied to it. They're always anxious thoughts. I'm not good enough. What if I could have done better? Anytime you hear yourself saying should, what if, those are anxious thoughts, and those are very common in imposter syndrome.
I think you also mentioned that under anxiety is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome, correct?
Yes. Sorry. Under imposter syndrome is anxiety.
Okay, gotcha. Makes sense. Okay. And finally, another question we have, is there a moral imposter? Not about skills, but someone who feels they are not as good a person as others think. Because in Islamic work, moral character and righteousness probably is the equivalent of technical skills in the secular workplace.
Absolutely. I don't think there's enough research to, culturally sensitive research out there. So a lot of this research is done. They don't collect information about religion or background or things like that. And a lot of research, unfortunately, scientific, is done on, white Caucasian individuals. It's not done from a religious or cultural perspective. So if my scientist brain tells me that if I was to, collect data from 500 Muslim women or Muslim men or, Catholic, Christian, any denomination, religious denomination, we would come up with a moral imposter, because there is God, a fear of Allah, fear of God, whoever you believe in, and you would feel like you're not doing a good enough job. You're not striving hard enough. You're not doing good enough. So my money is on that.
Awesome. Awesome. Again, thank you again, Dr. Adnan, by the way, for answering all those questions and for this great presentation. This does conclude the end of our Q&A segment. And it was a true pleasure to have you with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. What an honor.
Thank you. So to everyone else, this does conclude our workshop, and I want to thank you all for attending, and we hope that you got to learn a thing or two about overcoming imposter syndrome from Dr. Adnan herself. And then for those of you who registered on Zoom, you will be receiving our self-help guide and our feedback created again by Dr. Adnan in your inbox soon. And then for those of you who didn't register, you can also access our guide at www.nisahelpline.com/wellness, which we will paste in the chat. And then you can follow us on our social media or at Nisa Helpline, or you can also search us up on our website, again, at nisahelpline.com/wellness, to get more updates about future workshops and upcoming programs, so that you guys can stay tuned and attend more amazing workshops like this one today. So I want to thank you guys all once again for joining us, and assalamu alaikum. Okay, I'll just quickly put this in the chat for everyone. There you go. Awesome. Thank you guys so much once again.